Well, first of all, I guess I'll say on behalf of both of us, thank you, Vanessa, for the very generous and kind introduction. And I also want to thank the ASF for facilitating this wonderful encounter at the conference, and a great occasion also to see colleagues and friends, both new and people I know for many years. So anyway, thank you for putting this together. So as Vanessa mentioned, the book, our talk today is based on a book that we are co-writing and in progress, and so we will be maybe giving a small taste of the book and the subject which we're dealing with today, so we'll be presenting this jointly, and so I'll begin, and then we'll be moving back and forth. So I hope it's not too disorienting, but we thought that also it will be an expression of some of the synergy that has animated this project, work on this project jointly. So I will begin. It is nearly 80 years since the Vichy government imposed a reign of terror on the Jewish population in France and in its overseas colonies. Morocco, under the control of the French protectorate, was no exception. From the summer of 1940 to November 1942, Jews were persecuted by the colonial government in Morocco. When France fell to the advancing German armies in June of 1940, followed by the armistice and the establishment of the collaborationist pro-Nazi regime in unoccupied France at Vichy, the French colonial governing authorities became de facto parts of Vichy's pro-Nazi anti-Semitic regime. The Vichy Statute for the Jews of 1940, revised in 1941, was modeled on the anti-Semitic Nazi Nuremberg laws. The anti-Jewish laws adopted by the Vichy government were enacted with some modification as royal edicts, as dahirs, and vizierial decrees in Morocco. These laws were aimed at excluding Jews from public positions, schools, and institutions, and banning Jews from a range of professions and businesses. The aim was to effectively remove Jews from prominence in society and the economy, to undercut their livelihoods, and eventually expropriate property and assets, to Aryanize the economy, as it was called. The Jews of Morocco were terrorized by the methodic attempts to remove them from society and the economy. Many felt that they faced an existential threat. But it's not the persecution of the Jews that remains foremost in the historical memory of the Vichy period in Morocco. Rather, it is the story of the Moroccan Sultan, Mohammad bin Yusuf, later known as Mohammad V, courageously defending the Jews from the anti-Semitic laws in defiance of the pro-Nazi French colonial authorities that is the focus of Morocco's legacy during World War II. Mohammad V is glorified for having saved the Jews from the existential threat that they faced. The story of the heroic king that saved the Jews from peril circulated during the war and is memorialized to this day by hundreds of thousands of Moroccan Jews throughout their diaspora, by the Moroccan government, by Moroccan Muslim intellectuals, and by promoters of Muslim-Jewish understanding worldwide. In the second decade of the 21st century, the story remains iconic, a source of pride for Moroccan Jews, a symbol of Moroccan exceptionalism in the Arab Muslim world, and a beacon of hope for peace and reconciliation between Muslims and Jews. The story, however, has had its doubters. For decades, there's been a debate about what the true role of the Sultan was during World War II. On one side of the debate, the Sultan is seen as a hero who protected Jews during the Holocaust, or more. He prevented them from deportation to the European death camps. Others have argued that he did nothing to protect the Jews, that he quite willingly signed the anti-Jewish dahirs. Some have claimed that he even entered into secret negotiations with the Nazis. Historians of the period have pointed out that he had no political power and was in no position effectively to oppose French policy. The debate itself, however, tells us more about the contested identity politics since the 1970s of Moroccan Jews, Moroccan-Israeli relations, and the positioning of Morocco in the larger world. It tells us little about what in fact happened to the extent that it can be known. From a careful reading between the lines, the hundreds of thousands of documents preserved from the period, we have concluded that the Sultan was instrumental in mitigating the impact of the anti-Jewish laws, but not in the manner that his actions have been interpreted and understood. This story has been mythologized in ways that defy plausibility, and this has raised skepticism, questioning the validity of the protective role played by Mohammad V. But what we have come to realize is that it is the story within the story that is most revealing. In 1941, the story of the Sultan's pronouncement to the French authorities that, as is often said, there are no Jews in Morocco, only Moroccan subjects, began to circulate. It is the account of this pronouncement, more than any specific action taken by the Sultans, that actually shaped the course of events during the Vichy period. The story later became part of Morocco's national narrative, told and retold in various ways and for different purposes. What then gave rise to the story of the Sultan's courageous defense of the Jews in 1941? The stage was set when Vichy's anti-Jewish measures were intensified following the creation of the Commissariat Général aux Questions Juives, the General Commissariat of Jewish Questions, at the end of March 1941, headed by Xavier Vallat. News that the Vichy government was soon to implement harsher anti-Jewish measures was reported in the press in Morocco. In May, rumors of the Sultan's staunch opposition to the anti-Jewish measures began to circulate. On June 2nd, 1941, Vallat enacted a new law to replace the Statute for the Jews of 1940, which was adopted in Morocco by Dahir on August 5th, 1941. The new anti-Semitic law greatly expanded the excluded professions and imposed the numerous clauses, severely restricting the number of Jews allowed in public schools and in the liberal professions. The Moroccan version of the law, however, did make one very important distinction between Moroccans and non-Moroccan Jews. Moroccans were permitted to continue practicing traditional artisanal activities and the retail trade, out of concern that banning Jews from these professions would destabilize the economy and thus undermine the strength of colonial rule. In conjunction with the Dahir and following metropolitan Vichy policy, another decree ordered a census of Moroccan Jews, which required Jews to submit a declaration of their civil and family status, professions, and property. The census greatly alarmed the Jewish community, for its intent was the eventual expropriation of Jewish property and assets. That would accompany the closure of Jewish-owned businesses. Stage 2.
Vallat was intent on seeing Vichy's Jewish policy carried out in North Africa, and was likely informed of the Sultan's opposition to the anti-Jewish measures. To ensure that both the residency, as the department of the Resident General was called, and the Makhzen were in line and would enforce the new measures, Vallat traveled to Morocco shortly after the revised anti-Jewish dahirs were promulgated. On August 19, Vala went to pay homage at the mausoleum of the first Resident General Lyoté in Rabat in the company of the Resident General Noguès. They then went to the imperial place, they quote, where they were received with the traditional ceremonial manner in solemn audience with His Majesty the Sultan, end of quote. Other high military and civilian officials in Morocco, as well as task officers of the cabinet of the Question Juive, also participated in the audience with the Sultan. From Rabat, Vala traveled with his party to Fez, the traditional capital and spiritual center of both Muslims and Jews in Morocco. In Fez, Vala was welcomed by the French military and civilian leaders, the local governor, the Pasha Mohammad Tazi, and the local president and representative of the Legion of Combattants. The entourage then proceeded to the Mellah, the Jewish quarter where Jews had resided since the 15th century, when a walled-in Jewish quarter was constructed near the Palace of New Fez. The Mellah, as the Jewish quarter came to be known throughout Morocco, was historically the center of Jewish urban life in Morocco, the home of both the wealthy elite and the poor. During the course of the 20th century, Jews in Fez began moving their homes and business out of the overcrowded and confined space of the Mellah to the growing European neighborhood of the city Ville Nouvelle. While several hundred Jews lived in the European quarters of Fez in 1941, the vast majority still inhabited the narrow streets of the Mellah. It was there that the Pasha presented to Vala the chief rabbis, committee members of the Jewish community, and notables of the Jewish section of the city council, the Majlis al-Baladi. The procession then strolled through the Mellah amid the throng of people, and then at a meeting hall of the community, Allah addressed an assembly of Jewish notables, where he was reported to have declared, and I quote, "The task, as you know, is to devise steps to be taken here as elsewhere, not to persecute you, but to eliminate from certain aspects of our economic life the Jews who have overrun our political life," end of quote. Vala's visit to Fez could not have been more alarming to the Moroccan Jewish community. The very same day of his visit, a decree ordering Moroccan Jews who had moved to the European quarters of the cities after 1939 should evacuate their residences and return to the Mellahs was announced to Moroccan Jewish subjects. Whether or not the Dahir was at the instigation of Vala, the residency, or the Makhzen is unknown, but it is certain that Vala was privy to the discussions. In Vala's brief visit to Morocco, he brought pressure to bear both on the residency and the Sultan in Rabat, then proceeded to the most important center of both the Muslim and Jewish spiritual leadership to intimidate the Jews, accompanied by both the French authorities and the Pasha. The inconceivable had not happened, and whatever faith the Jewish leadership may have had in the residency in protecting their community must have been dashed. A few weeks after Vala's visit, probably feeling that further appeals to the French authorities would be futile, the Jewish leadership of Fez invoked the traditional protection of the Sultan in the ritual sacrifice of 4 oxen, one at the gate of the imperial palace, another at the tomb of Moulay Youssef, the father of the Sultan, and 2 at the mausoleum of Moulay Idris II, founder of Fez and descendant of the Prophet Mohammad, and since the 15th century, the holiest shrine of the city. The ritual sacrifice in supplication for the protection of the Sultan by the Jewish notables was followed by other appeals and meetings, sometimes secrets, between members of the Jewish community and the Sultan. Jewish leaders continued to express their unflinching loyalty to France, for the future was uncertain and the French still wielded the power in Morocco. At the same time, they saw the advantages of reclaiming their position as dhimmi subjects of the Sultan under his protection in accordance with Islamic law. It was another 14 months until Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of Morocco and Algeria on November 8, 1942, In this period before the Allied occupation began, according to both written records and oral testimony, delegations of Jews periodically met with the Sultan, Mohammad bin Yusuf, who pledged that both Jewish persons and property would be protected from harm. However, since the Sultan had no control over officials in charge of implementing the decrees, and since his very move was closely monitored by the French, how is it that he could have impact whatsoever in mitigating the impact of the anti-Jewish measures?
The explanation lies in the very structure and logic of the protectorate that remained in place even during the Vichy period. Vichy officials were strident in their efforts to ensure that the protectorate authorities fully implemented the anti-Semitic legislation of the Vichy government, aimed at removing Jews from jobs and schools and the eventual expropriation of Jewish property and possessions that would reduce Jews to conditions of penury. European supporters of these draconian measures also fervently believed that if the Jews were to get their comeuppance, Muslims who were resentful of Jews' advancement in society and their arrogant disregard of their place in society would be more supportive or acquiescent of the colonial regime, thankful to the protectorate authorities for leveling the playing field and even gloating over the Jews' demise. This, they believed, would strengthen France's position in Morocco and guarantee the continuation of colonial rule. For these reasons, the central Vichy administration in France probably assumed that Sidi Mohammed bin Yusuf would lend his moral support to the efforts to persecute the Jews. At the very least, however, they were assured that as a puppet of the colonial regime, he would acquiesce to the signing of the decrees. Here a little background is necessary. Mohammed bin Yusuf began his reign in 1927 as a young man of 18. He led a cloistered existence under the watchful eyes of the Residency. This was the system established by the first resident general, the Marshal Lyautey. Under the guise of maintaining Moroccan sovereignty, the French preserved the reigning Sharifian Alawid dynasty that ruled Morocco since the 17th century. As descendants of the Prophet Muhammad and commander of the faithful, the caliphal title that signified the rightful successor to the Prophet, the sultans of the dynasty were greatly venerated. This was well understood by the French authorities who promoted the royal ceremonies of the Sultan, but without granting any of the powers the sultans had once exercised in pre-colonial times. While day-to-day governance was conducted by Moroccan officials, the Mahzan, they were cautiously controlled and under the surveillance of European colonial officers. The power of the monarchy was symbolic at best, with all the coercive authority and control exercised by the French protectorate and the Spanish colonial authorities in the northern zone. The Sultan would rubber stamp edicts with the imperial seal, which were in fact laws drafted by French officials who would supposedly consult with the Sultan and the Mahzan authorities under the authority of the Grand Vizier before completing the dahirs and vizierial decrees. The Sultan had no choice but to endorse the dahirs, including the anti-Jewish laws of 1940 and 1941, for his refusal to do so would jeopardize his position, indeed, the monarchy itself. Through the period that Vichy ruled Morocco from June 1940 to November 1942, the Sultan continued to be paraded as the ruler by the French authorities in his day-to-day ceremonial meetings with French government officials and participation in Muslim festivals and visits to Sharifian shrines and Muslim institutions in various parts of the country. The promotion of the French of the ceremonial aspects of the monarchy, however, was a two-edged sword. While it lent legitimacy to the protectorate, it sowed the seeds for the emergence of anti-colonial nationalism. The nationalists in the 1930s began to rally around the Sultan as a symbol of national unity, for it was only the Sultan, the commander of the faithful, who had the prestige and following to unify the country. As seemingly powerless and obsequious as Mohammed ben Yusuf appeared to be, it was the strategic invocation of the Sultan's symbolic capital that won the day, and that enabled Sidi Mohammed ben Yusuf to lead the country to independence, preserving the monarchy as the primary power in governing the country. Mohammed V's defense of his Jewish subjects during the Vichy period was a decisive turning point for both the young Sultan's emergence as the national leader of Morocco. It came at an opportune moment. While the defeat of France did not cause the collapse of the colonial empire, it did expose France's weakness that anticipated decolonization after World War II. Furthermore, its anti-Jewish racial laws undermined the very legitimacy of the protectorate, which was based on the maintenance of Moroccan sovereignty, an Islamic state with a Muslim ruler whose duty was to safeguard all his subjects, including the Jews. The unchallenged implementation of the laws stripped the Sultan of the sole prerogative that the colonial regime afforded the dynastic rulers. Ironically, the anti-Semitic laws implemented in Morocco were a kind of inversion of one of the principal justifications for the establishment of the protectorate in the first place. The European powers had claimed that the Jews had been subjected to arbitrary treatment and were not adequately protected by the sultans of Morocco. Protection of the Jews and ensuring that the Sultan fulfilled his duty to his Jewish subjects was part of the legitimizing logic of the protectorate established in 1912. But now in 1940, the anti-Semitic decrees by a weakened France undermined their own justification for the protectorate. Herein was an opportunity for the Sultan to distance himself from his French overlords. He signed the Dahirs, true to protocol, but made his own opposition known. However, what in fact does it mean that he made his opposition known? For the Sultan had no independent connections to the media, which during the war were under heavy censorship. Furthermore, every move that the Sultan made, all public meetings or speeches, were closely monitored by the French authorities and reported in the daily press. So the real question is, why did the French authorities not keep the Sultan's opposition to the anti-Jewish laws secret, and instead leaked rumors about the Sultan's intervention to protect the Jews? This is a puzzle that has not been well understood. It would seem on the surface that the resident general Nogues and his administration had little to gain from discrediting the Sultan by spreading rumors about the Sultan's defense of the Jews. Some of the fiercest supporters of the Vichy regime among the European settler community in Morocco mistrusted Nogues, the resident general appointed in 1936 under the detested Popular Front government of the Jewish socialist premier Léon Blum. They objected to Nogues's cultivation of ties with the monarchy, which they believed already wielded too much power. The settlers, and especially the zealots of the Légion Française des Anciens Combattants, the veterans organization which served as a spearhead for Vichy's national revolution, complained of Nogues's leniency in enforcement of the anti-Jewish laws and already brought pressure to bear on the residency. The French authorities leaked the information, therefore, to deflect criticism of the administration for Nogues's lackluster implementation of the anti-Jewish decrees. The residency, for the most part, saw the exclusion of Jews from the economy as harmful to Morocco and its stability in wartime, and this could jeopardize French control of the country and its legitimacy as a protected power. By implicitly attributing opposition to the decrees to Mohammed ben Yusuf, blame for easing the restrictions could be passed on to the Sultan, who was, after all, fulfilling his duties under the very terms which the protectorate was established. After the Allied invasion and occupation of Morocco, and as the French free forces were reestablishing their control of the colonial regime, the opposition of the Sultan to the anti-Jewish laws was exploited by the French administration to distance themselves from the fascist Vichy government, by arguing that the protectorate authorities had endeavored to mitigate the effects, or at least of at least some of the anti-Jewish decrees, which was true, but which they had attempted to camouflage during the Vichy period.
But in the cynical game that the French colonial authorities played, it was the monarchy that gained the upper hand. The story of the Mohammad V protecting Moroccan Jews during World War II served the monarchy well by exposing the weakness of France and its hypocritical efforts to legitimize the protectorate and the continuation of the colonial rule. Much has been made about the motivations of Mohammad V, his altruism, courage, and particular affection for his Jewish subject. We have no reason to doubt these virtuous sentiments, but paramount in the Sultan's action was asserting his role as Muslim ruler of the nation in opposing French colonialism by fulfilling his duties in protecting his protégés, his dhimmi subject. For the Sultan, the protection of his Jewish subject implied the maintenance of boundaries, and traditionally for Jews as well, recognition of the boundaries, not equality, is what ensured peaceful coexistence. Modernization, the development of a new profession, and the growth of bourgeois European neighborhood, and new forms of leisure activities began to challenge some of the traditional boundaries, the modus vivendi of Muslim-Jewish coexistence throughout the ages. The destabilization of boundaries and the existing social hierarchy accelerated intercolonialism and the massive settlements of Europeans to North Africa, brought about both simultaneous common grounds and increased tensions. Though still a small minority of the Jewish population as a whole, a disproportionate number of Jews took advantage of the new opportunities, benefiting especially through the expanding networks of modern schools of the Alliance, Israélite Universelle. The embourgeoisement of some Jews, even though still a relatively small minority of the community as a whole, heightened awareness of a growing gap between the social advancement of Jews and Muslims undermining the traditional boundaries. The social factors were combined with external influences increasing tensions in the 1930s, the conflict in Palestine and the rise of the Third Reich, the Nazi-exploited tensions in Palestine, and the solidarity of Muslims across the Arab world to encourage anti-Semitism, especially among anti-colonial nationalists. With these growing Muslim-Jewish tensions in the 1930s, the Makhzen became increasingly concerned that Jews had overstepped their bounds and focused especially on cohabitation in mixed neighborhoods and Jews employing Muslim servants. Fast forward to the 21st century. The question of how much the law ordering the evacuation of Jews from European neighborhoods was implemented resurfaces. When Jews in Morocco were included among the Holocaust victims' entitlement to compensation. Efforts to include Jews living in North Africa either under German occupation, as was the case of the 6 months in Tunisia, or Vichy-controlled North Africa for reparation, led first to an agreement that the German government would pay restitutions to Jews sent to forced labor camps in the Maghreb in 2005. Since 2011, the Claims Conference, the organization responsible for negotiation with German government for payments to Holocaust victims, reached an agreement that Moroccan Jews who were subject to regulations restricting their freedom of movement under the Vichy government of Morocco were entitled to a one-time payment. The one anti-Jewish measure that best fit the criteria was the Dahir's ordering Jews to evacuate the European quarters, even though it was at the very most loosely inspired by Nazi persecution. What is at stake in these deliberations, just for the sake of time, we're going to conclude right now. What is at stake in these deliberations, however, is much more than whether historically Jews in Morocco were in fact Holocaust victims, but rather the contested identity politics of Moroccan Jews. Perhaps the image of forcing Jews to return to the Mellah might evoke a semblance of the ghetto established in Poland under Nazi occupation. Such an image would poignantly show how much Moroccan Jews suffered deprivation, as did European Jews, and thus bear witness to their being an integral part of the Israeli national narrative, of which the Holocaust is so central a part. But including Moroccan Jews in this larger story of persecution during World War II, and thus entitling them for compensation as Holocaust victims, also called to question the story of Mohammed V, preventing Jews from being harmed and persecuted. For it is through this story that Moroccan Jews have proudly shaped their own Holocaust narrative, which sets them apart from being merely victims of persecution, since the Sultans defended them from the anti-Jewish laws. Yet, ironically, it seems that he had little interest in preventing the order to expel Jews from mixed neighborhood, the most important measure that qualified the Jews as Holocaust victims. This, however, need not to be understood as inconsistent in Mohammed ben Yusuf's position during the Vichy period. For protecting the Jews from racially inspired laws and threatening their very livelihood, while at the same time reinforcing the boundaries, such as with the question of cohabitation, which had ensured the level of stability between Jews and Muslims, were both assertions of Moroccan sovereignty in the face of colonial regime, which during the Vichy period adopted harsh and repressive policies and affected not only the Jews, but the Muslim majority as well. One page. In the 1980s, the story of Mohammed V protecting the Jews during the Holocaust began to grow. On 18 September 1986, the Urban Council of Ashkelon, an Israeli city on the Mediterranean where Israelis of Moroccan descent had formed its majority, approved with a narrow margin naming a square after the late King Mohammed V. After Prime Minister Shimon Peres' summer meeting with the late King Hassan II on 23rd July 1986, Eli Dayan, the mayor of Ashkelon, who was born in 1949 in Qalat Sraghna, Morocco, before migrating to Israel in 1963, strongly supported the idea, arguing that, I quote, the King Mohammed V was a friend of the Jews. He granted them his patronage and saved many of them during World War II, end of quote. The same year, and under the official support of King Hassan II and Shimon Peres, the Rassemblement Mondial du Judaïsme Marocain was created in Montreal, making one of its central missions the recognition of Mohammed V for his support of the Jewish community during the Second World War. On July 10, 1987, in the aftermath of the negative reception that the recognition of King Mohammed V received in Israel, a movement of Moroccan Jews in Israel known as Bia Together was established and presented an official document to Dov Shilansky at Yad Vashem to launch the procedure of recognizing Mohammed V as righteous among the nations. The request was met with doubt. While Yad Vashem doubted the role of the king, of the Sultan, the Moroccan Jewish community with representative in Israel, France, Canada, Morocco, made the first international pitch for the recognition of the Sultan and presented an official letter to King Hassan II in 1987. On July 21st, 2007, less than a week after being sworn in as president, Peres declared his support for the nomination of Mohammed V as righteous among the nations to the State of Israel's official Holocaust institution, Yad Vashem, one of his first public causes of his presidency. In December, to conclude, in December 2015, at the Ornate Synagogue in New York City, King Mohammed V of Morocco was posthumously awarded for his courageous resistance to the Nazi-inspired anti-Jewish legislation implemented by the French colonial government in Morocco. In the presence of Moroccan, Muslim, and Jewish dignitaries and diplomats, the award was received on behalf of the present King of Morocco, Mohammed VI, by Her Highness Princess Lalla Hasna, sister of the King and granddaughter of Mohammed V. The award and the ceremony came at the initiative of Peter Geffen, the director of a progressive Jewish school, Kivunim. It was the first Martin Luther King's Rabbi Avraham Shoah Heschel Award made by the school, which declared that, and I quote, Mohammed V stand for us as a model and did, as Dr. King said, and risked his position, prestige, and even life for the welfare of others, end of quote. Speeches were delivered, and the words of King Mohammad VI were read by André Azoulay, Jewish counselor of the royal cabinet, in praise of Mohammed V's benevolence towards the Jews during the Holocaust. If during World War II, the Sultan's actions could be interpreted as the assertion of Moroccan sovereignty, the story became important for Morocco, for Mohammed V, as independence approached to refashion the monarchy as modern, as a defender of human rights and civil rights, in which Jews would become Moroccan citizens with equality. As the Holocaust itself came to be at the very center of the debates on human rights, genocide, and international law in the years that followed World War II, the efforts of the Sultan to protect the Jews during the Vichy period became a Holocaust story. And it is this narrative that prevails to this day. Thank you.